Just a heads up everybody, for this video I'm recording on the road, so apologies if the audio or video are a little bit different. I wound up packing all my stuff with me rather than skipping a video during RCQ season. As you can tell, I'm in my childhood bedroom. So without further ado, let's jump into another RCQ Deck Tech Primer video. Mono Green Devotion in name itself is an archetype that is enough to kind of spook and give some bad memories to Pioneer players. The archetype itself was combo-y and resilient enough to be the sole reason that Karn the Great Creator got a first-class ticket to the ban list in the format. It snagged cards from Exile, it built a deck with 75 instead of 60 cards thanks to Karn's minus ability, being able to have a wish board that was extremely impactful in game 1, and the ability to make so much mana that you needed a notepad to track it at comp REL events was enough to have pushed away a lot of Pioneer players from the format. Since Karn has kicked the bucket, however, the format has kind of had this big green-shaped hole in the middle of it, as the shell of the deck that was left over was not powerful nor proactive enough without the toolbox of artifacts and the loop that Karn had to kind of threaten to end the game on the spot. However, the deck has been resurfacing recently with a slightly different plan of attack, one that is familiar enough though to the mono green pilots of the past to start dusting off their Nykthoses and re-sleeve their Kioras. This time around, it's getting some help from an Outlaw and a Phyrexian Praetor to stomp the competition into the ground. Let's dive into Mono Green Devotion with white. Now, the current iteration of the mono green shell can kind of be looked at as a Timmy's dream come true, as the deck features nothing but large creatures starting at the 3 mana mark and gets to keep drawing cards thanks to its new engine tools, and can still just make the incredulous amounts of mana to power everything out as quickly as possible. The deck has reverted to relying on the combat damage route in order to actually end games, so there's a little bit more stompy going on than the old version of the deck. However, the deck still does have some combo elements to it thanks to its card draw engine and the mana that Nykthos alone can make. Instead of just talking about what it can do though, let's hop in to see how the deck is built now so we can see what has replaced the giant Karn size hole that was left in the deck. The deck still focuses around pumping out tons of mana thanks to the Devotion mechanic attached to Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. Devotion importantly counts the mana symbols on all permanents, which means we aren't confined to only putting creatures into play in order to increase our potential mana reserves. This is important to note, as the deck now uses Leyline of the Guild pack to its hidden full potential. Packing 4 Leylines gives us a 39.3% chance to start with at least one of them in our opening hand, meaning we can have 4 free Devotion on turn 0, in addition to not needing to run lands other than forests in our deck to create white mana. This also means that another piece of our mana puzzle, Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, both adds to our Devotion count by 1 and allows us to untap our Nykthos to get multiple activations in a single turn. A full package of each elf at 1 mana allows us to activate our Nykthos as early as turn 2, producing 5 total green mana with the help of that turn 0 Leyline, allowing for us to power out just about anything in our deck on the second turn of a game. Multiple Leylines in play make for an insurmountable board state for any deck to overcome by just their second turn. A combination of Oath of Nissa and Invasion of Ixalan help us find these pieces to our mana battery, in addition to finding follow-up threats to slam down. Notably, Invasion finds any permanent, while Oath of Nissa can only find lands, creatures, and planeswalkers, so Invasion can chain into Oath, but not the other way around. Both of these stick around under our control, so they add to our Devotion count while continuing to dig through our deck. Wolfwillow Haven isn't as always included in the list now as it was before, but the enchantment allows us to double our mana for a single land, and it works great with Kiora to generate 4 total mana while adding Devotion to our count. To keep on the Devotion theme for just a moment longer, the green deck deploys 2 powerful stompy creatures to fuel the green mana pip requirement for our Nykthos, Old Growth Troll and Cavalier of Thorns. These 2 mainstays from the older version of the deck offer a whopping 3 Devotion each, while packing a powerful body of power and toughness to go along with it. Troll is a 4/4 trampler for just 3 mana, which would already be a great rate for the cost, but it also has the ability to come back as a pseudo Wolf Willow Haven when it dies, and can become a token version of itself when you need to push that little bit of extra damage. Cavalier of Thorns is a massive stone wall of a creature with a 5/6 body and the Hidden Reach ability to block even flyers. When it enters, you reveal 5 cards and can put any land from among them onto the battlefield, which allows us to find a Nykthos if we need one, or another untapped copy to keep going with our Devotion chain. Putting the rest into our graveyard isn't ideal, but we do have some cards that have flashback. If our opponent ever removes our Cavalier, we also get the chance to exile it instead of putting it into our graveyard, which then allows us to put one of those things we've milled or something else that's died over the course of the game back on top of our library. One of the newer additions to the deck does have an aggressive body for its mana cost, but is really in the deck for its static effect. Outcaster Trailblazer is a 4/2 for 3 mana that is effectively 2 mana as it generates a mana of any color when it enters, which is actually great when you combine it with its plot ability because it actually gives you 1 extra mana for your turn. You can then use that recouped or accelerated mana to help cast other creatures to activate its static ability, which allows us to draw a card whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield. Now you may notice that this is the exact same static ability that Kioras Behemoth Beckoner has, which means that not only do we get an effective 8 copies of this effect, but we get to have 1 of each of them on the battlefield simultaneously. This extra boost in card advantage is what has catapulted the mono green Devotion deck back into the limelight, as it gives a resiliency to the deck that is slightly different than what Karn did, but has similar staying power in its games. Once you have one or both of these engines with Nykthos online, you can essentially draw out your deck entirely with enough mana. You get a new Nykthos from a Cavalier activation or trigger, or from a normal land drop of yours, or you untap from a new Kioras. There's just so many things you can do once you're drawing cards for every creature that you cast. If this didn't seem powerful enough, you also get to keep using Storm the Festival in the deck as a way to get 2 permanents with converted mana cost 5 or less from the top 6 cards of your library. This includes your big creatures to help draw cards, or replace with Kioras, replace with Nykthos, and then you just keep drawing cards and creating mana from there. The flashback ability of Storm the Festival means that you won't mind binning this to a Cavalier of Thorns trigger, since the 10 mana requirement to cast it from the graveyard doesn't really mean a whole lot when you have almost infinite mana from Nykthos. Now, all of this power in digging needs to lead to something. And although we can't just keep looping for forever and eventually kill our opponents with Karn-board artifacts, we do have a specific target we are looking for when we have enough power and toughness on the battlefield. Ulvenwald Oddity is a way that we look to end the game thanks to its ability to transform itself, which gives all of our creatures a tiny overrun effect, most importantly giving them haste and trample as part of this, so we can swing with the double-digit amount of threats we vomited onto our board this turn. So, with a bunch of ways to make mana, a bunch of ways to find our oddity, we don't need to run a full 4 of this card in our list, but most decks are still running multiples so we can find it quickly, or in case it gets milled over by a Cavalier. The last creature that sees a lot of sideboard play, but has crept into the main decks on occasion, is the main reason for the deck having that little asterisk next to the mono green part of the name. Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, is a white card in a sea of green that not only shuts off our opponent's enter the battlefield effects, but doubles our own. This means all of our card draws from Outcaster or Kioras get doubled as they trigger off creatures entering the battlefield, Elesh Norn included. So draw 2, draw 4, draw all you need to just win the game. Now, while that makes up all of the non-land main deck cards for the normal mono green list, I would be doing a disservice to the deck tech if I didn't mention a slightly different take on the same deck, the Yorion version of mono green. With a splash of white in order to cast Elishnorn, Yorion is not only castable, but a perfect way to flicker everything to restock your hand with a bunch of enters the battlefield triggers. It also gives you access to some extra slots for creatures and some spells, which seem to have a little bit of variety and a lot of versatility in this list. Elder Gargaroth, Emrakul the Promised End, and Tulsimir, Friend to Wolves, have all popped up in the extended 80 card versions of the main deck as singleton threats you would normally want in your sideboard for different reasons anyway. Elder Gargaroth provides another hidden reach immovable blocker that doesn't even die to a lightning axe, while providing plenty of utility with card draw, token generation, and life gain when needed. Emrakul is a game-ending threat that allows you to quote-unquote mind control opponents into making mistakes you can kill them the following turn. But it also provides 3 points of Framplin power that Ulvenwald Oddity can take complete advantage of. Tulsimir, meanwhile, provides similar utility to Elder Gargaroth, but on an ETB trigger alongside a fight trigger with a wolf token to help clear out smaller threats. Cityscape Leveler sees play as a card that was sometimes grabbed from your sideboard by Karn already. Although a cast and attacks trigger over an enters the battlefield one, it is an 8/8 that destroys anything on your opponent's side that isn't a land, so it's pretty powerful on its own. The last card that sees play in the Yorion package is Archdruid's Charm, which has 3 or 4 copies in order to find pretty much any creature you want, or ensure another way to get your Nykthos, or remove a problematic opposing creature with a bite effect that also gives one of yours a +1/+1 counter. There's just a lot of modal versatility in this card, and when your deck gets larger, it gets less consistent, so having a tutor that can also do other things from your hand is pretty strong. Although the mono-green Devotion deck seems to always have a ton of mana, the deck only has as many lands as an aggro deck would normally run, with like 21 total, 10 to 11 of them being basic forest. 4 copies of the Devotion engine Nykthos are a requirement, while 2 Lair of the Hydra make a backup mana sink to help close out games. 2 Boseiju Who Endure are main deck freebies to fight sideboard cards like Dampening Sphere that want to shut off our Nykthos, and Sunken Citadel has made an appearance in lists as a way to not only make white mana in addition to activating Nykthos all by itself. It also works with Castle Garenbrig if you choose to run it, as some decks have decided against putting a land in that can only ramp out creatures in the list over the planeswalkers and spells that we do want to be casting. Now, if you find yourself playing the Yorion version, the mana base gets a little bit different. Ready for this? Add 4 Temple Garden and 4 Branch Loft Pathway so you can generate white mana if you need it, and green mana most of the time. That's it. That's all that's different. The sideboards from the mono-green Devotion lists are a bit varied, but you have some very clear-cut cards that show up in multiples across a bunch of different deck lists. Pick Your Poison is becoming the most played green sideboard card in the Pioneer format, picking off problem enchantments and artifacts that want to shut down your game plan, in addition to big and small flyers like Vein Ripper or Slickshot Show-Off. Unlicensed Hearse is the easiest graveyard hate to play, as it is colorless, in addition to being something that can eventually kill our opponents in our Stompy deck. Obstinate Baloth is a double-purpose card, gaining life against aggro decks, and being something that decks like Waste Not are going to absolutely hate seeing when they Thoughtseize your opening hands. Trust me on this one. The choice between Tailswipe and hard-hitting Question comes down to valuing instant speed, creature-only removal, or sorcery speed, but it can also hit planeswalkers. Otherwise, this sideboard slot is functionally the same, looking to buffer your Pick Your Poison with the cheapest and most efficient removal that the color green has to offer. From there, decks do diverge a little bit in their sideboard plans. Ones without them in their main deck put their copies of Elishnorn, Emrakul, Cityscape Leveler, Tulsimir, and Elder Gargaroth over here on the sideboard, while Thrun, Breaker of Silence, is an uncounterable, nigh unkillable threat against spot removal and control decks that also gets to naturally trample over opposing threats. Some decks are also putting in a couple of Arasta of the Endless Web, functioning as a mono-green stompy version of Young Pyromancer to make tokens whenever your opponent casts instants and sorceries, turning Phoenix and Prowess' spells against them. Polukranos Reborn is another triple green creature that was in some of the older versions of the deck, being a rough 4-5 reach body early and able to transform into a pretty solid Wormcoil Engine clone once you have the mana to transform it. Lastly, the Stone Brain is a holdover from the older version of the deck that not everyone is using, but it's a colorless answer to stealing away pieces from combo decks that works against lands as well, such as Lotus Field. The green deck does start to flow real easily once you get the engine online, and there's only one real quote-unquote nut draw for the mono green deck to have, although it can stack upon itself to get even more nutty. The best possible start for the mono green deck involves what I like to call Leyline-a-Palooza, where you start off the game with 3 Leyline of the Guild Pact as your turn 0 actions, followed by a land, elf, Nykthos for 12 total mana, or 13 with the elf, allowing you to cast up to 2 Storm the Festivals. This, of course, uses every single card on the play and is incredibly difficult to achieve. But when you do get there and hit a Kiora, you can just win outright on turn 2. Note that you only want 3 Leylines because having all 4 would take up your opening hand alongside the 2 lands in the elf, meaning we have just our top deck to find something to actually use our mana on. In reality, you're happy to get 1 or 2 Leylines in hand with this same opener, as 2 Leylines still let you cast a single Storm the Festival, and 1 Leyline lets you cast anything else in your deck except for Elesh Norn due to not having white mana. This type of deck, you're going to want to throw out your Elves and Kioras as soon as possible when playing, but you do want to keep in mind what your opponent across from you is playing if you're in a game 2 or in a situation with open deck lists. Throwing out an elf on turn 1, overplaying a tapped Sunken Citadel when you know that they have lots of 1 mana removal might not be the best. Whereas if you are playing into the removal spell, this could be the plan if you're hoping to force your opponent's decision between using a discard spell to see if you have a Kiora versus using their removal spell to kill off your elf, and then you can just untap, play something like a Wolf Willow Haven instead to accelerate your mana that way. You do want to be playing as far ahead of your curve as possible, but remember that your deck does have aggressively costed cards for their stat lines because of how many green mana symbols they have in their cost. So a turn 3 troll over a turn 2 troll isn't the worst thing, especially if it's a little bit more of a grindy or board state centric matchup. In general, your choices matter, and the deck is a lot less of a spreadsheet magic style deck. You have many more openings to attack and deal a decent amount of damage over the course of the game, to a point that you don't always need tons of card draw or Ulvenwald oddity to just kill someone. Always be on the lookout for attacking when you have cards like Old Growth Troll that can trample, and don't be afraid to take pot shots with a 2 or higher power layer of the Hydra when the opportunity presents itself. The oddity kill may be the fastest way to win a game, but playing like a normal stompy green deck is what will make your opponent react and clear the way for your Kiora or Outcaster Trailblazer to stick and pop off for the turn you need it. The mono green Devotion deck hasn't fully recovered its old top spot in the metagame, but it is rising through the tier list ranks across all different skill levels thanks to some of its good matchups. Decks that want to take a couple of turns to set up or try to stall out a board stand no chance against the green deck just doing its thing, so decks that are more mid-range won't quite cut it here. Because decks like Phoenix and Vampires can't kill green fast enough and lack the right cards to sweep away all of their threats, they end up having a rough time against Kiora and all of her new friends. Granted, Rakdos used to be a decent matchup into the old green deck, so I wouldn't be surprised to see a few changes, like extra extinction events, and then this matchup flipping back to a 50-50 type deal or even slightly Rakdos favored. Nivtalite likes to go big like we do, but much slower and often not before we can just kill them. Other small decks like Boros Convoke need a really good hand to beat through even our average starts, as they don't go wide enough for us to just not block once and swing back for lethal with an oddity. Decks that are a bit closer in matchup are some of the more aggressive and fast decks. Azoria Spirits used to completely smoke the green decks and is still a bit more favored, but the creature-centric path with plenty of trample damage and 4-power stompy creatures now can give them a bit of a harder time, as cards like Spell Pierce are no longer really good against our deck. Likewise, ever-resolving an Elesh Norn makes it hard for some of their flash spirits to do anything. Decks like Gruul Aggro are tough for green without a reach blocker for a slick shot show-off, but putting enough Pelucranos or Cavaliers in the way makes it hard for them to trample over any meaningful damage. They can, however, play with Fire our Elves early and set us behind, so it's closer than we'd like it to be. The Waste Not deck is also a bit of a toss-up, partly because their deck has a high amount of variance, so it can come down to which engine is online first, and partly because Outcaster Trailblazer is a redundant Kioras static ability, so things like Duress on 1 or 2 is much less impactful if we have an Outlaw in hand. Bad matchups for Devotion include faster combo decks and decks with a lot of permission, especially the newer Azorius control decks. Previously, the control shells relied on counter magic, but ever since Amalia came into town, they stock up on Exile, spot removal, and board wipes, which means that we really need to have a pop-off turn all at once, or it's going to be difficult keeping any of our pieces around to untap with. Speaking of Amalia, that deck is not only faster than ours on average, but we have no way of actually interacting with their combo game 1 until we get an Elesh Norn into play. So while that may be as quick as turn 3 for us, it is too slow on average for us to race their deck. Likewise, Quintorius and Lotus Field combo decks can come down to a goldfishing game of speed, with their average hands being a bit faster than our average ones, but I wouldn't be surprised if with more data, these two matches specifically are closer to even now thanks to our beatdown angle being a little bit stronger. The green Devotion deck had a lot of pilots and fans on its side in the previous version and previous iterations of the Pioneer meta, so picking this one up is only going to take a couple of games to realize how it operates differently. Then you start slinging stompy spells, draw cards, and do things a little bit different than the old Karn version would with its Karn Kiora loops. However, for someone new to the deck entirely, it can be a little bit harder to understand when you just need to kind of attack aggressively or when to deploy your engine cards to really just have a pop-off turn. If you're not used to playing with Leyline of the Guild Pact and Devotion, it can also be a little bit confusing knowing when to save one of your land mana producing over an elf mana producer in order to tap white for Elesh Norn, as Nykthos can only make green with its Devotion clause, despite Leyline giving lands the ability to make mana of any color. The Devotion mechanic is separated from that. So although the deck isn't overly complex and there's not too many types of kind of mechanics that you have to learn for the deck like a control deck might have, you still probably want about a month of FNMs or a handful of Magic the Gathering online leagues to just settle on not only how the deck operates, but figure out what your package of creatures in your main deck and sideboard are going to be, and if you want to wind up going with the Yorion version or not to have those extra kind of tutors for your silver bullets. So with Devotion having a resurgence in followers, are you joining back to the cause for RCQ season? Have you missed turn 1 elf into just flooding the board with big baddies, or are you kind of wishing that Nykthos kicked the bucket a couple of ban announcements ago? Either way, let me know in the comments down below, and while you're down there, feel free to like the video with a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it to help Devotion to this channel. As always, you can also tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general Magic content from me. See you later. I'll be back in my normal spot.